Good morning, everyone. I'm David Blight, Director of the Gilded Ornament Center at Yale. To those of you who've been with us the past 2 days, welcome back. To those of you who are new, a special welcome to the last 3 sessions of this Yale in Slavery and Historical Perspective conference, a very special conference for the Gilded Ornament Center. Frederick Douglass once wrote that memory was given to humans for some wise purpose. And we've been discovering a great deal about that, and this first session this morning is in its own way all about that. Today and every day, we acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Schaghticoke, the Golden Hill Paugussett, the Niantic, the Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations of the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. Today and every day, we honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and the land. To chair this first session, I want to briefly introduce my colleague and friend and neighbor, John Stuart Gordon, who is the Benjamin Attmore Hewitt Curator of American Decorative Arts at the Yale Art Gallery. John wears many hats around Yale. He's been the curator of many important exhibits at the Yale Art Gallery and elsewhere. I want to call attention especially to his recent study, American Glass, and particularly to a recent essay an exhibition that John has done on the now famous Calhoun College stained glass window that was knocked out in 2016. The remnants of it assembled, and John then assembled it in an extraordinary art exhibit at the Yale Art Gallery. He may speak a bit about that. Now Hopper College, I should say, not any longer Calhoun College. So without further ado, John, over to you to introduce our panel, this extraordinary group of art historians on race, art, and iconography at Yale and beyond. John, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for that very nice introduction. And I am going to talk about the window. To set the stage for this morning's wide-ranging conversation, I want to take a moment to situate us on Yale's campus and with this one particular object that may be familiar to many people. On a summer day in 2016, Corey Menifee, a worker in the dining hall at what was then called Calhoun College, broke a window. As he later recounted, quote, "I took a broomstick and it was kind of high. I climbed up and I reached up and I broke it. He hit the pane twice before the various pieces dislodged from their frame, fell to the ground and shattered." The window came to be as part of a spate of construction in the early 1930s that transformed Yale's campus with a new library, a gymnasium, and a series of residential and academic buildings. They were built in the collegiate Gothic style, which is itself a pastiche of historical references that is in itself incoherent, but tells us a lot about the early 20th century vision of the past. For Calhoun College, it was decided that the windows in the common room would depict John C. Calhoun, while the windows in the dining hall would present scenes of the South. The windows were made to look old with fake repairs, and they were as sepia toned in their subject matter as they were in their coloration. Most panes in the dining hall featured plants or animals. Depicted any reference to humans, including Calhoun's house, Fort Hill. They depicted a view of the South that pastoralized sustained racism under a gauze of nostalgia. These images perpetuated the lost cause narratives that emerged in the South after the end of the Civil War, and by the 20th century, pretty much dominated our discussion of the war in both the South and the North. I mean, these windows are a case in point. They are windows depicting the South, made by craftsmen in Philadelphia to the specifications of an architect in New York for a client in New England. This was a pervasive narrative. Generations of students, faculty, and staff passed through Calhoun's common room and dining hall. Many only glanced at the windows, while others debated the subject matter amongst themselves. Over the years, the windows became what I like to call passively pernicious, inspiring the occasional op-ed, but they were largely receding. That is, until one was broken in protest. As a curator whose job it is to care for cultural objects, I admit I'm a little uncomfortable with the willful destruction of a work of art. Yet I know that that framework shifts when art is installed in a public setting. Art has the power to move people. Art is and continues to be a vital part of our society. Images have power. And while a window may just be a pane of glass to some, it can encompass whole worlds to others. Yesterday, Frank Mitchell shared some of Kristen Haas's thoughts on monuments. To launch us off, I want to circle back to two of those thoughts. First, that monuments are doing their best work when they seem to fit seamlessly into the landscape. When they stop being visible, their job is done. And second, that monuments are more about the time in which they are made than the time they memorialize. I thought these were really compelling observations. And thank you to Kristen for writing them, and thank you to Frank for sharing them. And it made me think about objects like these windows as maybe anti-monuments. We too often let things like this slip seamlessly into the landscape until a moment of protest or introspection makes them noticeable again. And yes, they may be more about the time in which they were made than the time they memorialize, but don't forget about the time of reception, what we think about them now, and how our relationship to and knowledge of the world are continually evolving. This morning, we will hear from Cheryl Finley, Louis P. Nelson, Romita Ray, and Barbara Earl Thomas. I will introduce each just before they speak. We are more interested in the idea of conversation, so we hope to keep our formal comments brief and leave as much time as possible for discussion. As questions or comments occur to you, please enter them in the Q&A, and we will try to address as many as possible. First up is Cheryl Finley, who is director of the Atlanta University Center Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective. She's also distinguished visiting professor of art history at Spelman College, where she directs an innovative undergraduate program that prepares the next generation of African-American museum and visual art professionals. She is a curator, contemporary art critic, and award-winning author, noted for her 2018 book, Committed to Memory, The Art of the Slave Ship Icon. Her comments today are titled Black Art Futures. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks so much, John. It's great to be here, and good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Is it possible for me to share, Daniel?
Yeah, you should be able to share.
Okay, I'm sorry, I think got it now. Okay. Good morning again. So, thank you so much again, John, for that really wonderful introduction and setting such a visual context for us, but also a moral imperative for us as well this morning. I just want to thank you for that. I'd like to thank David, the GLC, and the organizers of this conference, and Daniel for your tech assistance as well. I'd like to dedicate my remarks this morning to Robert Ferris Thompson, who was my advisor in graduate school in the History of Art department. So Bob, this is for you. And I want to set my remarks with these images sort of in the context of an ecosystem. I'd like for us to think about ecosystems today. That's my word for the moment, at least. And I want to maybe step back into about 20 years ago or so when I was at Yale doing my PhD dissertation, the result of which is my book, Committed to Memory, which I'm showing you here. But when I applied to graduate school, it was at a time in the mid-1990s where I want to say there were ecosystems that were in the process of producing the kind of work that ultimately appealed to me. There were images and installations created by artists like Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. This is her installation view of The Seven Powers Come by the Sea, which is a mixed media installation that riffs off of the very famous and much reproduced schematic image of the hold of a slave ship, description of the slave ship, or the image I call the slave ship icon. And with this installation, she not only sort of writes the image, turns it on its side to become, on the one hand, a memorial marker, perhaps tombstone marker, marking lives that cross the transatlantic, but also suggesting in this work that religious practices like Santeria coalesced even in that transatlantic crossing. And you see figures here representing some of the major deities of Santeria in this work. There were other works that I saw as well, including this one here by Ingrid Pollard, a Black British artist entitled Windrush from 1997. Again, using really interesting technologies at the time, again, thinking about how digital technologies could help us revision and re-examine historical archives. Another part of my remarks this morning will be about archives and also the way in which archives at Yale, at least for me, and I think for many of us, and the work that we all need to do together, can help us to think about how these icons and how images relating to Yale and slavery can be put to use in the present day. Other artists as well, including Betty Sarr. This is her I'll Bend But Will Not Break from 1998, another mixed media installation, again, riffing off of this image. Were images that I saw, but there were also things happening in the media in the mid-1990s that pushed me to think about this project, and even classes when I was at Yale. For example, one of the very first classes I took in African American Studies, and John, I just have to thank you again for your comment about that stained glass window. I was actually a graduate resident fellow in the former Calhoun College. And I was there, and was not aware of that image when I was in residence there. So I thank you for your scholarship, and also I thank everyone who's really brought that image and this work to the fore. But I mention this to say that, when I was in school, one of the first classes that I took with Hazel Carby in African American Studies, my degree is in African American Studies and art history. And that course was one that had us look at, everyone had to read a book. You choose the book from the list that she had shared with us. These are all new and cutting edge books that had just come out. And The Power of Place by Dolores Hayden, who was then at Yale in American Studies, was the one that I read, and was really inspired by the work of Pierre Nora, but also the work of Dolores Hayden and people like Sheila de Bretteville, who's in design and architecture at Yale, to really think about the place of monuments and memorials and public placemaking, even thinking about the way in which we, remember, even if we're thinking about cognitive mapping and the way we mark space ourselves as we move about town. And so the following year, my second year, I took a course at the British Art Center with a visiting professor, Anne Birmingham, on the long 18th century. And it was a material culture course where we looked at and examined many of the objects from the BAC. We were enlisted to do what was called an object lesson, that is, finding something from the collection, taking it out, and really doing a deep study of this image or object and to present it to the class. Many of my classmates were working on portraits of the landed gentry, tea services, things that were made sort of with fine and higher skills of the long 18th century. I instead really was interested in looking at a way to have and inspire a more engaged conversation about the slave trade, in fact, and the money and the wealth that was created from the slave trade that was fueling many patrons to work with artists and artisans to perfect their crafts. And I ended up presenting on Liverpool specifically, but in an ancillary way, Bristol, by using maps, sort of just ephemera, printed material, and city directories to talk about the way these cities expanded as a result of their engagement in the transatlantic slave trade. And it was with this work that I ultimately came across the image that I call the slave ship icon and began my in-depth study as a dissertation following that. But I just want to say that in terms of what I wanted to highlight around ecosystems, I'd like for us to think about the archives at Yale as a form of ecosystem and the way that they interact with public life, with student life, in New Haven, with the life of activists and artists as well in New Haven and around the country, if not even globally, to imagine a Black art future using these rich archives. They were something that were foundational for me, including the British Art Center, including objects such as these, a fob seal with the motto, "Am I not a man and a brother?" That's in the collection at the BAC. Other objects, including works by Wedgwood, as you see here on the left as well, are in the BAC collections. And there are many, many works, not just, of course, relating to this period, but others that I think could help us forge a path forward as we contemplate, what does it mean to study, to convene together over a 3-day period to talk about Yale and its history and our ties to slavery, and also to talk about that in the current moment. Of course, this is the image that I discuss extensively, looking at this image description of a slave ship as it has many lives and continues to have many lives through the work of visual artists. This is the example, a really fine example at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where I spent many, many hours. Other works there at the Beinecke include this one here, that's an original version of, original first edition rather, of Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative. And he was a free Black man living in London in 1789 at the very same time that the image description of a slave ship was published, and actually talks about having seen this plate, he says, representing the Negroes who are stowed on board. This is the words of Equiano. The Guinea ships. I'm pleased to send to Mr. Reverend Mr. Clarkson, a worthy friend of mine. He says that I'm filled with love and gratitude for your humane interference on behalf of my countrymen. So there's a way that the Beinecke, in terms of its collections, also was there to validate many of these studies, including other rare works like this one here, Remarks on the Slave Trade, that was engraved by Matthew Carey for the New Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, not the slave trade, in Pennsylvania in 1789. These were plates that were circulating across the Atlantic in the late 1780s. Other rare works like this, including Carl Bernard Wadstrom's essay on colonization, had a number of different works in it that I've referenced, but also have become works that have inspired a new project called Mapping Slavery, that looks at historical maps and as the way that historical maps inspired not just the work of slave traders, but also visual artists over time. Other works that were in this collection at the Beinecke include this one here from Abolitionist Tracts, just to think about how archives can be really, really rich and deep, and there are different ways to study one single object from different perspectives over time. And this is an early 19th century version from 1822, and also from a different context, I would add as well, from an abolitionist tract, or even to look at the work of someone like Wood and The Mirror of Misery, which actually appeals to children. So to spread the word, even in children's literature, around the turn of the the turn of the 19th century. Or if we jump forward to the 1960s in the work of someone like Amiri Baraka, here we have examples again at the Beinecke of his Slave Ship, a one-act play, including stills of that work, which are ways to think about how different collections can intersect and overlap within different rare book and manuscript libraries. Also thinking around the 1960s too, even the Sterling Memorial Library, Mudd, and others had collections and works that were very useful for this study. Another thing to consider as well, not just the British Art Center, but the Yale University Art Gallery holds works. And this is Agnes Martin's Islands No. 4, which inspired a poem by Elizabeth Alexander of the same title that was included in an exhibition in a book called Words for Images, celebrating the 300th anniversary of Yale University in 2001. And it was through interviews and a conversation with Elizabeth Alexander that even at the time I was working on my dissertation, that we shared information. And this becomes actually the epilogue at the end of my book, but to kind of think about how for Alexander, if we're talking about images and icons, that she says and wrote to me when we discussed this, that she looked for images that she wanted to write about in the collection at the time. Again, this is around the turn of the 21st century, but she could not find something that really moved her. She found this small image and reminded her of the image of the slave ship. And I'm going to quickly conclude with thinking about, again, this notion of ecosystems, and thinking about others who in and around New Haven really started to mark the landscape around Yale University as it relates to the history of slavery and the slave trade. So, the Amistad Foundation, the memorial by Ed Hamilton that we see in New Haven on the site where enslaved Africans from the Amistad were held in a jail, or the Freedom Schooner Amistad that was launched in the year 2000. Again, to think about the circulation of these kinds of ideas and the way that we can use memorials to mark spaces, or to think about something like even the Freedom Trail itself. And then finally, other arts institutions that are really beginning to make a mark on the city of New Haven. Next Haven, of course, led by Titus Kaphar, who was a student at the Yale School of Art. Or if we were to look too at something like Art Space New Haven, that's headed by Lisa Dent, and also, of course, to celebrate our own alumna, the new head of the Yale School of Art, just to kind of think about ways that we might consider new ideas that are circulating in New Haven, and ways to really answer this question, and also, I think, make good on Black art futures. I'll conclude just by proposing something that I hope we can discuss together, but to think about, what the future might hold, to think about notions of, how and where and when it's useful to memorialize or to mark space, to make monuments. And I'd like to propose that we look at emerging and current technologies to try to do the type of work that could have a sustainable impact. So that, if we were to talk about monuments, it might not just be commissioning an artist and selecting a site and doing our historical research, but rather it might be something that would also coincide with looking at emerging technologies like blockchain, smart contracts, and NFTs, and how there could be some form of shared equity that comes out of a monument-based public art program, somewhat like the Percent for Art program that was established in New York City in the late 20th century. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for those comments, Cheryl. And I really am struck by your honing in on the archive, which is a thing that is publicly accessible yet simultaneously hidden, and I think may have a nice metaphorical framework that we can play with in our discussion later. Next, I'd like to bring up to the virtual dais Louis P. Nelson, who is Professor of Architectural History and Vice Provost for Academic Outreach at the University of Virginia. He's a specialist in the built environments of the early modern Atlantic world, including the American South, the Caribbean, and West Africa. His interest in the landscape of slavery, combined with the events of August 2017, led to a co-edited book of essays, Charlottesville 2017, The Legacy of Race and Iniquity. His comments today are titled Reseeing Slavery at UVA. Welcome.
There we go. Let me share my screen. Thank you so much, David and John, for inviting us to be part of this session. I am looking forward to the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts briefly. What I'd like to do is I frame my comments really around four poignant moments, intersections of art, race, and memory at the University of Virginia. Four moments which encourage us to remember that images, memorials, any visioning is itself a selective thing, and it's a curated thing, and therefore it is a political thing. And so building off Cheryl's recommendation for thinking about ecosystems, I'll encourage us to think about landscapes, landscapes of exclusion and exclusion. The first of the four vignettes really is one of the most iconic representations of the University of Virginia, which you see on the screen, produced by printer Benjamin Tanner, which appears in the top corner of a map produced in 1826, exactly at the moment of the opening of the University of Virginia, as well as just prior to the death of the university's founder, Thomas Jefferson. Benjamin Tanner's view represents the university as Jefferson wished it to be seen. And it is important for us to recognize that this particular framing of the university presented here from the open end of its long, narrow re-envisioning of a quadrangle is exactly as Jefferson wished us to see it. And it is the way that we have continued to see it for many years. And there's embedded in there a distinctive political problem. The map, the Tanner view is the representation of the academic core of the University of Virginia, with 5 pavilions on either side with a rotunda at the end. And I've shown you just 2 photographs of those 10 pavilions. And in most people's imagining across our community, across our nation, and at the University of Virginia, this is still the view that represents the University of Virginia. This is, in fact, for many of us, still the University of Virginia. But as this digital model, which we've been producing recently, helps us to see, it is in fact not the historic core of the University of Virginia, but it is a curated selection of that space. So this digital model pulls back into an aerial view, which helps us to see that in fact there's a whole lot more that has been cropped out of the view that Jefferson wished us to see. He curated for us the academic core, which is the fronts of the various pavilions and the rotunda, and has, by consequence, cropped out the working landscapes to either side. This particular artistic rendering helped the university, encouraged the university to sustain a false imaginary that this was almost exclusively a white landscape, because Jefferson, in fact, does render for us only what he would have hoped would have been the white landscape. This view, however, the digital model, represents a more fuller representation of that landscape, reminding us that at any moment in time where there are 150 white young male students at the University of Virginia, there are at least 150 to 200 enslaved African-American women, children, and men who are laboring to support that particular space. And so the rendering that Jefferson presented for us, which has continued to be the iconic imagining of the University of Virginia, continues to perpetuate the harm of exclusion, that same exclusion that Jefferson might have wished for his own democracy. We are right to remember that Jefferson could never have imagined a multiracial American democracy. A second vignette, a second moment in imagining and memory, of course, is Moses Ezekiel's incredibly important presentation of the statue of Thomas Jefferson, which, as you can see, the rotunda immediately behind it sits in that very same landscape, just on the north terrace of the rotunda beyond the academical village. Ezekiel's monument represents Jefferson standing aloft on top of a figuration of the Liberty Bell, reading the Declaration of Independence, the Liberty Bell framed by four figures of freedom, equality, justice, and brotherhood, engulfed in it's sort of wrapped with a narrative that declares that Jefferson proclaimed liberty throughout all the land to all unto the inhabitants thereof. It is important for us to remember that Ezekiel, of course, is producing this exactly in that same moment of the rise of the lost cause. Ezekiel, in fact, was a teenage combatant in the Civil War, fighting for the Confederacy, was a friend of Robert E. Lee's, was a fairly close discussing with Robert E. Lee. Lee recommended that he leave the United States for Rome to become an artist, which he did in 1868. And for 40 years in his studio in Rome, was framed on one wall the Confederate battle flag. Ezekiel was forever committed to the memory of the lost cause, and so, which is a reminder for us that this representation of Jefferson, hotly contested, of course, this would be the very same monument that would be surrounded and be the moment of that explosive contest in August of 2017, the very same monument. This monument is not just a representation of Jefferson, encouraging us to understand the complexities, contradictions, and hypocrisies that are embedded in the person of Jefferson himself. But of course, it is also a memorial to and a monument to the construction of the harmful mythology of the lost cause. It is not an accident that the Jefferson Monument at the University of Virginia would soon be followed by Ezekiel's completion just 4 years later of a monument entitled The New South, which would be more popularly known as the Confederate Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. This monument is not just an expression of the complexities of who Jefferson was. It is also an expression of the fact that the University of Virginia was a central agent in the construction of the mythologies of the lost cause. Skipping forward a little closer to the present, the third imagining here, the third vignette, is actually this particular plaque, which we now politely refer to as the apology marker. Installed in 2017, this particular marker was an expression from the Board of Visitors of the University of Virginia, an extension of a statewide apology for the simple fact that the state of Virginia had engaged in the institution of slavery. It supported the institution of slavery. But the language that was written and its location are both worthy of reflection. Let me just read it for you. And just in honor of the several hundred women and men, both free and enslaved, whose labor between 1817 and 1826 helped to realize Thomas Jefferson's design for the University of Virginia. A few things to note here. The only name, of course, once again, is Thomas Jefferson's. Their labor is worthy of honor only in the sense that it is actually dedicated to the realizing of a white man's vision. And it also delimits their contributions only to the moment of its construction. I'm regularly asked, am I the professor that teaches about how slaves built the University of Virginia? And I'm always pushing back to say, let's please say enslaved peoples, and let's not delimit their contributions just to the period of construction, which of course would be dominated largely by enslaved men. In fact, we have a significant responsibility to talk also about the contributions of enslaved women, especially during the 40 years thereafter of the operation of the University of Virginia. Not only offensive, not only in its language, but also in its the fact that it is underfoot. It is embedded in a walkway, and it's embedded in a walkway that's underneath the rotunda. So in its position, in its language, in its writing, and in its location, it served to catalyze a robust and vigorous response amongst African-American students at the University of Virginia. And so while we might really decry the shortcomings of that particular monument, and in fact we should, it led to many years of agitation, coordination, and eventual and discussion amongst African-American students at the University of Virginia, who then by 2011 actually launched a design competition, not in any way seeking affirmation by the university itself. Students, design students, art students, and activists from across the university coordinated this university-wide competition, design competition, which absolutely put front and center the inadequacy of the 2007 Marker Memorial, and catalyzed a much broader conversation across the university about the importance of taking the university's history very seriously. It's important for us to recognize that there had been, since the admission in the early 1970s of large numbers of African Americans, since the 1970s, there have been a whole series of white papers, demands by students at the university, primarily African American students, for equity and equal pay for workers, et cetera, a whole series of demands. Those demands had very little effect. It's worthy of recognition that it took a design competition, that it was artistic expression that actually catalyzed a significant change. 2 years later, then President Sullivan established the President's Commission on Slavery at the university in 2013, which Kurt Von Dack, who I think spoke yesterday or the day before at this conference, was central in the development and launch of that particular commission. I sat also as a member on that commission. The first and foremost recommendation from that commission was the establishment of the monument, what is now the memorial to enslaved laborers, realizing that the students' demands from 2013. This is that memorial, now recently opened. I'll walk through just a few features. The memorial here, beautifully photographed by Sanjay Suchak, the university photographer, responds specifically to a whole series of requests from the descendant community, and I'll come back to that point in just a moment. The rear wall is an array of names, all of the names that had been surfaced through our archival research at the university over the previous decade, represented here on the rear wall, together with an interior timeline. The descendants community insisted that we say the names, we heard that numerous times, but also that the memorial needed to be a place of education. And so this timeline, a portion of which you see here, tells the story of the history of African Americans in Virginia and at the University of Virginia from 1619 through the 1880s. But more important than the extraordinarily, I think, successful formal qualities of the memorial is actually the process. And this will be my final point. And that is the process that led to the design of the memorial was itself absolutely essential. It was an open and transparent process that before the single pen went to paper, there was 8 months of community engagement and discussion. It was made very clear that this memorial was not in fact for the university, but it was for the descendant community. Therefore, the university needed to spend time engaging that descendant community. That descendant community has now coordinated themselves. These are now two friends of mine, Datisa Gathers and Colleen Yates, whom I've now known for a number of years. These two women, together with 7 others, have now established a 501c3, Descendants of Enslaved Laborers at the University of Virginia. They're organized and they are regularly advocating for the responsibility of the university to engage in repair. The memorial itself was a process of establishing relationships of trust. That's what's really important here. That this memorial is, in fact, yes, it's an interruption, a disruption of the landscape at the university, but much more importantly, it was the beginning of conversations that led towards relationships of trust. It's important for us to recognize, of course, that that is simply acknowledging the past, a truthful acknowledging of the past, and there's a great deal of work yet to do. It is also completely transformed the social dynamics of the academical village at the University of Virginia. 1 week after the murder of George Floyd, a group of African-American students at the medical school insisted that, requested all of the health professionals come out for 7 minutes of kneeling. It's called White Coats for Black Lives. This is an event that normally would have happened in the middle of the academical village, right in the middle of the lawn. Those kinds of actions of protest were now redirected to the memorial to enslaved laborers. And so the space of both Black identity, but also Black protest now has new space at the University of Virginia. And that hopefully will speak to a future in which Black African-American students are more fully included and represented in the complexity of future University of Virginia. Thanks.
Thank you for those great comments. And those are actually indeed beautiful photos. I'm struck, I've heard you speak, Louis, a few times about UVA, and the idea of landscape is so great. And it's a nice reminder that although the landscape is reshaped and reformed over time and with different purposes, landscape is eternal and we can keep returning to it and relearning from it. So it's a nice through thread from our ecosystems to the landscape.
It's importantly evergreen.
Yes. So now I would like to ask Romita to reveal herself. And Romita Ray is Associate Professor of Art History at Syracuse University. She has published widely on the art and architecture of the British Empire in India, including the book Under the Banyan Tree, Relocating the Picturesque in British India. She is currently working on a project about the visual cultures of tea in colonial and modern India. She's also contributed articles on the collecting and iconography of Elihu Yale to the Yale University Art Gallery Bulletin, which is where I first encountered her. Her comments today are titled Silence.
Thank you, John, for your introduction. And I'm so excited to be part of this panel. I'm seeing Cheryl after many years. So I feel it's a reunion of sorts for me. I am a bit of an interloper, as many of you know, and you've heard already that I work on British India, but I think it's particularly pertinent given Elihu Yale's own legacies. And he's a figure that's loomed large over the kind of discussions that we've been seeing unfold, I think, for the past few days, and of course, beyond that as well. And I thought it was important to retrieve his figure, his complicated histories in the context of the discussions we've been having. So I'm going to share my presentation with you now. Just bear with me for a second, please. Here we go. All right. So I'm going to read my remarks because that's the easiest way to stick to our time frame here. So as a historian of the art of the British Empire in India, I begin with a picture painted by the English artist Robert Home of two Indian princes being taken hostage by Lord Cornwallis, Governor General of India. Held captive by the East India Company in the wake of the Third Mysore War, the boys ensured that their father, the much feared and hated Tipu Sultan, ruler of Mysore, fulfilled his treaty obligations with the company. To the left, The artist appears with his portfolio tucked under his arm, calmly looking at the transaction before him, a vivid reminder, as Sarah Thomas points out in her book, Witnessing Slavery, of validating the power of visual testimony. But are images reliable eyewitness accounts, or are they also troubled sites of erasure and propaganda? Figures of captive boys resist the logics of gentlemanliness and Christian duty. Their images shoring up the silences that till this day haunt the portraits of polite British men and women alongside whom they appear. In their images, we find the silence of the archive, as well as the silencing of their living histories, their sentience, and their agency as disruptors, perhaps, who refuse to comply with the terms of their captivity. And I'm bringing this up because Luis just mentioned the idea of curated landscapes and curated images. I think that's very important when we look at any visual representations. They are not transparent images. And secondly, Cheryl's talk actually brought up my own memories as a graduate student doing research in various archives in London and in Calcutta as well. And so many of us have encountered this over the course of our careers, that it's really, really difficult sometimes to retrieve the voices of people who are non-British in the colonial archive, Indigenous voice, the voice of others. They are conspicuously missing because the archive, of course, privileges the colonial rulers. They are there to gather, to consolidate, to cement knowledge in a very particular way that benefits their agendas. It's not meant to be democratic. And so when one returns to these images, one is always reminded that as much as these figures are so visible, the captive boys are so visible, their voices are completely silenced. So I now turn to a picture which has been the subject of a recent investigation led by the Yale Center for British Art. And there was a wonderful breakout session yesterday where the recent results of that investigation were brought to us in very, very compelling ways. Now, painted several decades before the picture I just showed you of Tipu Sultan's sons, this group portrait depicts Elihu Yale, who's in the center, the large figure, with his sons-in-law Dudley North and James Cavendish, his New England relative David Yale, who stands in the back, alongside a boy slave who you see to the right. Now, instead of the boy prince, we have a slave. Instead of reportage, we have aspiration, specifically in the aspirational figure of Elihu Yale, who dominates the composition as a rich retiree surrounded by recognizable signs of landed wealth. Property, as you can see in the background, in the form of a formal garden, going back to the presentation that we just heard. And this would have been attached to an estate. And we also, of course, have property in the form of a Black slave. While the exact location of the picture, if there is any, and the identity of the African boy remain unknown, what we do know is that by the time Yale retired in London, his fortune had enabled him to amass a vast collection of jewels, paintings, furniture, mathematical instruments, and textiles. He was really a polymath of sorts. And in this sense, he was both unusual and not, but this was a very particular type of aspirational figure who keeps popping up throughout, by the way, the 17th and 18th centuries. He was also a very wealthy landowner who had inherited a Welsh country pile from his father and purchased several properties in London. Whether or not he owned African slaves remains a mystery. But like many members of the British and European elite of his time, he was often shown with a Black servant and owned several objects that depicted ornamental Black figures. And I'm showing you a man who was very much part of Elihu Yale's circle, another diamond merchant. His name is John Chardin. This portrait is from the National Portrait Gallery. And you can see that Chardin also appears with an African servant over here. Now, auction records of Elihu Yale's estate sales mention a carved blackamoor's head that brings to mind the Drake jewel gifted to Sir Francis Drake by Queen Elizabeth I, with an intaglio cut cameo of sardonyx depicting an African male bust in profile superimposed over the profile of a European. And you can see that, that jewel actually hanging from the girdle or belt that Sir Francis Drake wears here. A kneeling blackamoor supporting a sundial, now in the collection of the Yale University Art Gallery, once belonged to Yale's Welsh estate, attributable to John Notes I, an influential sculptor whose quote-unquote figure of a blackamoor kneeling, being 5 feet high, holding up a sundial, this is from the records of the time, was in fact installed at Hampton Court. So the sculpture is yet another example of Yale's financial ability to commission artists who worked for royal and aristocratic patrons. Now, if the idea of gentlemanliness was bound up with the optics of property and wealth, then Yale was no ordinary gentleman. Despite his renewed connections with Wales and his links to English nobility through his daughter's marriages, Yale was fundamentally defined by his 27 years in India, where he had built an immense fortune that would finance the foundation of Yale University. A chapter of his life that was conspicuously referenced in at least 2 of his portraits, where Fort St. George in Madras is depicted in the background. And I point this out because when you look at Yale's life, India is where he spent most of his time. So it's not surprising that it is always inserted into his portraits. In 2006, I was commissioned by the Yale University Art Gallery to piece together Yale's vast art collection. Much like Yale's portraits, which are entangled with the threads of his life in North America, Britain, and India, my research led me to the Tamil Nadu archives, Fort St. George and St. Mary's Church in Chennai, formerly known as Madras, and to various archives in London and Chatsworth, the Duke of Devonshire's estate in Derbyshire. What emerged was a man whose personal wealth was built, not on the slave trade, but on the gem trade in India. Now, these two actually intersect, so I want you to keep that in mind. But the immediate asset is the gem, the precious stone. An astute businessman with a keen eye for precious stones, Yale will become a highly regarded gem connoisseur with deep connections in the gem trade in South India. His reputation drawing the attention of the Raja of Thailand, an avid collector of gems and jewels who sent royal emissaries to convince Yale to procure rubies, emeralds, and diamonds for him. And this was one of the surprises of the research that I conducted, because I'd gone in search of a lost art collection, but I ended up finding all these other geographical reorientations of sorts. All of a sudden, Thailand, Burma, emerge in the story and sort of coax us to look even farther eastwards. Yale was probably initiated into the diamond trade when he was appointed a factor or a junior company official at Fort St. George in 1677, the same year that the first English translations of the French traveler and diamond trader Jean-Baptiste Tavernier's 6 voyages were published. Not far from Golconda, and you see that circled in the slice of India to your left, the famous diamond mines, Madras, circled in red, was ideally located to tap into a vast and complex network of diamond trade that revolved around the lucrative node of precious stones. When the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb annexed Golconda in 1687, the Dutch, French, and English were forced to comply with his decree that all diamonds of a specific size would be confiscated as revenue. Now, I'm mentioning the Dutch, French, and English because they actually dominate this Coromandel coast here, along with the Portuguese. There are all these settlements, colonial European settlements dotting the Coromandel coast. And I should add that at this point, the English East India Company is a very small player in India. They are not yet the large, powerful company that we see from kind of the 1760s onwards. They're a very small presence. They're feeling their way around. They're there, and they're tapping into all these different networks And I'll show you some of them in a few seconds. Diamonds and other gems would preoccupy Yale long after he had retired in England. They would secure his daughter's dowries, settle into his private collections, adorn his portraits, and connect him with a long-established gem trade that wove its way through different corners of Europe. And I'm showing you another portrait of Yale in the Yale collections, art collections. And it's quite remarkable when you start looking at them close up, that Yale's portraits are actually studded with gems. And I'm showing you a detail here of his coat. They sparkle. He wears rings with diamonds on them. They're very carefully and subtly inserted, so they're easy to miss, and they're actually much harder to see in these digital images. But when you go up to the paintings in person, you can see them sparkle and gleam as you would expect cut stones to. I should add that this European trade of gems precedes Yale, of course, by many centuries. And many of you are familiar with the Medici family, for instance. Italy has a very strong tradition also of the gem trade coming from India. And these stones would then be they would be incorporated into jewelry design. So it's just, I'm giving you a glimpse of how diverse the gem trade is in terms of European consumers here. And this long-established gem trade also reorients Yale towards Thailand and Burma, Burma being, of course, the source of rubies, famously. Between these trajectories and the company's investments in textiles, spices, and very importantly, the China trade, Yale's networks in Fort St. George were as dense as they were diverse. And I know I don't have a lot of time to show you this, so I thought I'd create a quick diagram to give you a sense of all the networks that he is interacting with. So we have an incredibly, not only cosmopolitan, but also contested ground where these different networks that I'm showing you are in dialogue with each other, they're intersecting, they're rivals. So it's an area that really lifts us into this idea again of how networks very powerfully create new narratives for us. And the narrative that we are seeing here is a man of empire, to be. This is pre-colonial still in some respects in India, but he is foreshadowing this empire of exploitation that will come along. He's ambitious, he's worldly, he's ruthlessly also devoted to accumulating private reserves of liquid capital. Because remember that gems are very easily slipped across borders. They're precious stones that are portable and they're highly lucrative assets. And once relocated to Britain, they could be reinvested in land, art and artifacts, and of course, in human bodies. Seen within this broader context of global connectivity, Yale's group portrait urges us to look beyond Britain and beyond the politics of the transatlantic trade to engage with the complex cosmopolitanism of Indian Ocean networks. For it was through these networks that someone like Malik Ambar, the Ethiopian slave who arrived in the Deccan in the 16th century, would become a general in the Ahmednagar Sultanate and lead the Nizam Shahi troops against the Mughal army. The Mughals themselves owned slaves, by the way. And it is also here that the Dutch, stationed at Pulicat, north of Fort St. George in Madras, ran an aggressive slave trading enterprise using Madras, where Yale was based, for slave catching. And this is something else to keep in mind, is that these European powers are competing with each other in India as well, just as they do in North America. But you have the Danish, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, all of them are there, again, of course, for money, for wealth. Nearly 30 years prior to Yale's arrival in India in 1646, a disastrous famine ensured that slaves were available at low prices along the Coromandel coast. The Portuguese settlement of Santome suffered the most. During his time at Fort St. George, Yale undoubtedly engaged in trafficking in the Indian Ocean, where the Dutch, Portuguese, and French transported the largest number of slaves. When the Mughal government complained in 1688 about the number of children and servants stolen away from them, they specifically targeted the Dutch for their nefarious activities. And a cautious Yale and his Madras council immediately banned the trading of slaves further south at Fort St. George. And this is not to excuse Yale as such from the slavery narrative, but this is to give you a sense of how the Mughal government, which is really the big cheese right now, they are the most powerful entity at this point. And these European powers have to constantly balance their relations with each other with regard to the Mughal government. So their interconnectedness is mediated entirely but by what the Mughal emperor is doing in Golconda and of course among these slave networks. Diamond and slave networks overlapped, they intersected, and they played off each other. Each produced new bodies of wealth and each endorsed the fundamental idea of gentlemanliness. Each also produced its own fictions. Is the African sorry, there was another image here, but it's not showing up. Is the African servant real or imagined? Is Yale a wealthy retiree or a social climbing nabob? The group portrait raises questions that we may or may not be able to answer definitively. And in doing so, it situates Yale both inside as well as outside the standard narratives of slavery and slave ownership in North America. It is this nuanced positioning that needs to be researched further. In his 2016 installation, Enough About You, the artist Titus Kaffar crumples up his canvas to refocus our attention on the portrait of the slave boy. We are compelled to shift our focus to an enigmatic figure whose identity remains a question mark. The silence of the colonial archive is made visible. Yet in dismantling one silence, can we silence other histories? Do we create other fictions as we silence the cosmopolitanism of the Indian Ocean and Yale's presence, his place within its entangled networks? Can we in fact separate the two? I leave us with these questions, with the plea to think through and with this messy and dense matrix of transnational links forged by a multitude of different histories and geographies that stretch far beyond the Atlantic as we grapple with Yale's legacy of slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Romita, for that incredible talk. I think if you just, there we go, perfect. And today's, or this week's symposium is really about thinking about Yale College and University's engagement with slavery and abolitionism. But this is a great clarion call that even thinking locally necessitates thinking globally. And all of these stories are intertwined and you can't do one without the other. So thank you for that really great model that we need to take forward. So our final speaker this morning is Barbara Earl Thomas. She is a visual artist who builds tension-filled narratives through paper cuts and prints, placing silhouetted figures in social and political landscapes. She's also served as executive director of the Northwest African American Museum and has been a driving force behind the Jacob and Gwendolyn Knight Lawrence Foundation. She has an exhibition that's on view right now at the Seattle Art Museum. It's called Barbara Earl Thomas, The Geography of Innocence. It's on view until January 2nd, 2022. So if you're in the neighborhood, stop by. I adore Barbara for many reasons. Today, it's because she's in Seattle. So she got up before 6 a.m. to be able to join us. So I am eternally grateful to you for that. And Barbara's comments today are entitled, "The Past Holds the Present." So Barbara, if we can get you to turn on your screen.
I do mine. I didn't know if somebody else did it.
Oh, good. There we go.
There we go. So I am going to step up and move forward. What I want to talk about today is I'm here not because I'm a historian or an art educator in any kind of way. I was selected by a group of administrators and art historians to replace the windows that were broken that have been spoken of in what was the former Calhoun College that is now called the Grace Hopper College. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'm here because I have the honor of rethinking the narrative windows in what was formerly known as the John Calhoun College. John Calhoun, 1782, 1850, was a US vice president and an ardent supporter of slavery. He thought of it as the core of our economic system, our edge. Dying in 1850, who can say if he had an inkling of that in 15 short years, that period in that institution that he so fervently believed in would unravel. What you see here are a bank of windows in the Calhoun College, now called the Grace Hopper College. My image is superimposed. I look at this and I think of a book. I think, how can I put images here that can be read and not just passed by, but if someone decides to look up, they can read them. The history is a story we make from a group of facts draped around how we describe a set of events. How we record the story, we tell about those, we shape how we see the road leading from our past to our present, and it's fraught. I'm going to focus here on one small task: how to use my visual language to retell a story that reassembles the facts and shapes them from a slightly different lens. That lens now takes into account someone who comes from the lineage of a former slave, that would be me, as well as what it was before, the slaveholder. The fact of the name change is what signals that event. The name change to Grace Hopper College was long and arduous process, a forging of a sort. Forging comes with the image of fire and alchemy, of one thing melting from one shape into another. What you see here, actually the way it exists now, are blank windows, but I've superimposed my images on top of them. The windows having been broken by a maintenance worker, we've already heard that story, who decided that seeing those windows daily was just too much. In my thinking, these windows read like a book, and each window is a page in a narrative that unfolds for the viewer. My task has been to take the former narrative, which illustrated slaves in the foreground, seen in a vast cotton field, holding baskets of cotton, and to retell that story that now includes the new name of the Grace Hopper College. It was certainly a technically true statement that we had slaves and that they were all there, but how they were depicted has now been addressed. Can we go to slide 2? In our history, this image is called "What is Broken is Mended," and this will be one of my new images. It'll be done in glass, but here I've done it as in paper, just as that's my sketch. What is broken is mended. The break is not erased or denied. It is a history, and it's there, and we all know it. But we choose to step over it as we move forward. In our slave history is a blight and a blemish on the body politic that is surrounded by a body of literature that justified its existence. That story was rooted in religion and economics, two powerful systems, one about the destiny of the soul and the other about the destiny of money. And for more than 200 years, we invested heavily in these stories. Even as our Constitution read, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, I feel that what we've been living since that time is in a vast landscape of cognitive dissidence. My next slide, please. The winds of change, we go from the Hopper, from Calhoun to Grace Hopper. And I want you to look particularly at this image, because this image for me was where I had to step up and go like, am I going to erase the history, or am I going to document that we have made a change? And I decided that what I needed to do was to look history straight in its face, its brutal reality. The wound is there, but it will not be erased. So the image I'm speaking about here is actually, I have the robin taking John Calhoun's name and putting it in the background, and the hummingbird bringing Grace Hopper's name to the foreground. So anyone who goes and looks at our history can say, this is how we got here. This is the sign in the road where the change happened, And I wanted to document that. Can we go to my next slide, please? What I was working with, and John Stuart so aptly showed, he is the reassembling of these images. But we have this very romanticized and caricature of what was. And certainly there were slaves and they were in the field and they had cotton on their head and people played the banjo, but it was not all happy-go-lucky. And so I wanted to hold both of those. I wanted to retell this story, but hold this image as part of the rich ground that I got to dip into when I did my image. May we go to the next image? Here we have from the 1930s, I flash forward, and we're well out of slavery, but the image of the hanging man is well established in our reality and imagination. This is the price we paid for that war that set us free. What I want to do in my image is that you see going forward is to take that image and give it back to my viewer as a human being. Next slide, please. In my slide, I call The Gentleman. This is a paper cut, and it's in my current show called Packaged Black that I have that's on view now at the Henry Art Gallery, a collaboration with Derek Adams. In this gentleman, I see the hanging man return to his body, not as some mythic king, but as a normal human that I place in the landscape. Next slide. This piece is called Color Wheel, and you see the color wheel right behind the boy. I say that for this child that will become the man, I surround him with the word. The titles that I think the titles of the books around here are one way of telling the story of this young person. On one side, you see Black boy, and the next side of him, you see the native son, and at the very bottom, on top of the ruler, you see Between the World and Me. So you have Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and Ta-Nehisi Coates telling the story of a young Black boy. And this is his history, and I wanted to surround him with that history. Next slide, please. For the child that will become the man, I surround him with the word and the titles that I think would be how I would tell that story. In this next slide, I call Boys in Bloom. It's another way to show how you grow from the ground into something that contains the seeds from the past, but allows us to sidestep the morass of the stereotype, the old story that no longer defines us. Next slide, please. This is a boy with a gun. Our past holds our future. We are a country with a violent past that persists. None of us is exempt. It's in the water, the myth, the reality, the cruelty we heap on each other. I have this boy here with a gun, but it also contains the seeds of Columbine, Parkland, and all the ways we are violent to each other. The seeds of many of the images that you've seen have come from my study and my research into violence in my country, and what I think is part of, really, at least for African Americans, part of slavery's, what it's bequeathed us. And I delved deeply into the roots of that. And I was really attracted to this movement that was in Chicago called the Don't Shoot movement. Can I have the next slide? And the Don't Shoot movement, there were all of these gatherings in Chicago, and it was in the last 10 years. And the children would appear with their parents, and they would hold these signs that said, "Don't shoot, I want to grow up. Don't shoot because I want to go to college." And I was thinking, what is that legacy, and how does slavery still sort of overshadow where we are? And it's also what I took back and put into the windows that I'm creating for Yale. And I want to admit to the broken, but also think about how we are mending that. And can I have the last slide? I took the picture of that young boy who had the sign in his head, that hand that said, "Don't shoot." And I'm going to leave you with what I've replaced it with. I've replaced that sign in his hand with the word grace. And that is where I will say Grace is that place between the event and the response, the place before you pull the trigger, cast the epithet. Where we stand in history at this moment is in the effort to recast the moment before the body is strung up or blasted apart. We can only do that if we see the gentleman who grew from the boy as a human. The work in these images has been to tell a story about how the past holds our present. Calhoun College is now the Grace Hopper College, but in the line of things, Calhoun is not erased, but exists in a line of change. I've taken the man from the tree, but the history remains as a reminder. So as we walk along the road, he marks that change. And that's where I will leave you. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Barbara. It was an amazing experience being a part of a large and really great body of people who were challenged to find artists to make new windows for Hopper College. And I will say we were all struck by Barbara's sensitivity, her eloquence, and her engagement. And she came and spent time with the students. She spent time on the campus. And we appreciate that. And I just thought it was such a great moment to really make something that's generative. And I was struck by your idea that history is a story we make from stories, and we have to mine those stories. People have been putting in comments and questions. If you have more, please enter them in. I'm going to start us off a little bit because those of you who were able to attend the keynote session on Thursday may have heard President Peter Salovey's introductory remarks, where he put out a call for some kind of memorialization to take place on Yale's campus. And this seems like the group of people to take a first crack at this idea of what do you even mean by memorialization and how can this be? And I was struck by a comment that Romita made about reportage versus aspirational images, that even in history, we have images that show what we want to be, even if that, you might not have had an enslaved person in your household, but you wanted one. The tension between fact and wishfulness. We're now at another moment where we can choose reportage or aspiration. And so what do we aspire to have memorialization look like? I can call on people, or people can just lob in as they want. But I think Lewis wants to start because he just turned his camera on.
No, I was just trying to animate the session. But since you've called on me, I'll offer just a few thoughts. I think aspiration and reportage is absolutely there's a tension that has to be considered. And I think that the agents behind producing a memorial absolutely need to be honest and transparent about where they stand in the spectrum between those two. I'll also say that it's incredibly important. There's two other dimensions that I would say are incredibly important. One is that memorials, we often think of memorials as static and permanent. And one of the things that I think Barbara's presentation so beautifully shows is that these artistic expressions occupy a moment, but in a trajectory, and understanding that there's this larger historical trajectory is really, really important. So not thinking of the monument as the definitive statement is essential. But then, and I think even more important is whose voice is at the table for the production of the monument. As with the University of Virginia, Yale is a predominantly white, very powerful organization. And if the decisions around what that looks like is made largely by the institution, then I would say that it's going to be owned by the institution and not by the people it has harmed. And so if this is about thinking about building relationships, then process is more important than product.
Thank you. I want to, Cheryl was raising her hand. I also just want to point out that some people had asked about Elizabeth Alexander's poem, and a link to that has been put into the chat. But here, Cheryl.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Louis, for your comments. I just wanted to, maybe respond to what you were saying, Louis, in that I think process is hugely important, not just for what the end product is, but for how it affects the people who are involved. And your presentation really showed that. One of the things that I was trying to get to at the end in terms of looking at, what I guess for me, what was this, archival immersion, as a graduate student, and then, competing and overlapping networks and ecosystems that produce the work that I ultimately, wrote as a dissertation some time ago, but to think about the evolution of New Haven itself. So for this particular invitation of a monument, if we have, Titus Kaphar right there at Next Haven, if we have the Yale School of Art, if we have Art Space New Haven, how might these institutions, together with scholars, together with art historians and African Americanists and historians, put something together that might make a statement that we're, that we can take on into the future. But I think the other thing that I just want to bring back is, I really think it's an opportunity to, it's like you can make a memorial, you can mark the landscape, right? We can go back to the conversation about Confederate memorials if we want to, but we do that, then we die, and then what happens? Can there be something? I would be more interested in Yale or whomever is going to be doing this, making a statement that actually has something attached to it that's going to go beyond just the physical marker, that might in more deeply actually involve the landscape, the landscape that we all inhabit, so that there's it's not just passing by something or seeing something, but that there might be an immersive element to it. And that, again, going back to current technologies and technologies that we may not even be aware of yet, that are also immersive, but that enable ways to actually repair, to compensate, to, develop contracts that will, kind of sort of like the percent for art, formulae that have been around for 75 years or so, but even using, smart contracts and NFTs to be able to say, okay, we've created this monument, we're using these archival materials, we're working with artists, and it's going to not just be here in perpetuity, but it's going to benefit these people who were so dispossessed, also in perpetuity, right? So that's kind of my thinking about some of the issues of the memorial. And yeah, so I'll stop because we have hardly any time.
Ramita, do you have anything you wish to add?
Yeah, I mean, this has been such a rich panel discussion, and I'm so grateful to Barbara for her very thoughtful work on the Black boy, because one of the figures that I really wanted to present because of her work was the contested figure of the boy that appears, whether it's in Indian art, whether India-related material, whether it's in the portrait of Elihu Yale. I think it's important to also, in some ways, not get too seduced by the archive. Cheryl and I were having a separate chat about this, because we have to remember archives were formed by the colonizers, right? As I said, it benefits a certain narrative always. And as much as we are pulled into the archives, which are extremely important for us as historians, we also have to be mindful about perhaps creating new archives as we go forward, that it's not just about the past, but also thinking about memorialization, thinking about how do we creatively reimagine these histories and produce new archives now, which bring into dialogue all these global connections, right? That place us in positions where we are also made uncomfortable by our own histories, where we are constantly reorienting ourselves. It's like a prismatic impact of sorts. So I think thinking about what archives will look like going ahead is really important. I think, Barbara's work is already creating a new archive of sorts. That's extremely important for us, what an archive will comprise moving forward in research institutions like Yale, which have incredible collections. Absolutely, Cheryl, and the interventions. These themselves can be seen as interventions, right? Because one of the things that I think Barbara's talk really hit home for me is that we're constantly pressing these figures of, the Black slave boy, or even the princess that I showed, into positions of complete dispossession, as if they have no voice at all, as if they never resisted. And we need to also see them as figures that maybe troubled these narratives that we're talking about. They didn't always comply as much as they were limited. So, to look at them as powerful figures in their own right, I think that needs to be also grappled with, if I may say so. So I know we don't have a lot of time.
We have 1 minute left, and I'd like to give Barbara a chance to say the last word, which is daunting.
Well, all I say is that we're here now. And I really feel like we need to take care of our present as much as we need to take care of our past. And I think we've been in this whole cycle of going back and kind of cleaning up the past. The past is what it is. What are we doing now? And how will we have that conversation together? And we'll define how we go forward. So I think it's everyone's tasks. It's not just Black people who have to go in and say the thing. We've got to learn how to talk to each other. So hopefully you all will be a big part of that, because you're the educators, and I'll make some images, and let's make some mistakes and forgive each other. That's what I say.
I think that is the perfect way to end. I am so grateful to all of you for sharing your time and expertise. And I'm grateful to David for inviting us all here.
Thank you, David.
Thank you all.
I was so mad at you because now I'm here. And I did it. It's done.
Did you all hear Barbara say, I'll just make some images? Come on. I mean, my goodness. If we were in person down in Luce Hall or somewhere, I have a feeling the audience would give you all a standing ovation. Not privileging this session over others, but my goodness, this was rich. I wish we could go another hour. Thanks, John, Lewis, Cheryl, Ramita, Barbara, fantastic. Stay tuned, everybody. You're going to hear our playlist now for the next 10 or 15 minutes. We'll be back on at 10:45 with our session on history of science and medicine at Yale. Thank you all. Fantastic early morning session. Thanks.
Playlist. Let's dance.
Ciao.
Let's roll.
Yeah.
Boogie
Thank
time.
you.